Before dawn on February 14th, 1943, the sky over the Tunisian desert split open with the roar of German armor. Columns of dust rose across the valley floor as elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions debouched from Third Pass and struck the American positions around the village of Sidi Bouzid. Within hours, the tanks of the United States 1st Armored Division, dispersed by orders from a commander who had never visited the front, were being picked off one after another by concealed German guns. American infantry on the surrounding hills, isolated on their ridges and unable to support each other, were cut off and overrun. Anti-tank guns sat abandoned in the wadis. Half-tracks burned on the plain. Young American soldiers, many of them in combat for the first time, threw down their equipment and ran for the rear. Over the next 9 days, the Americans would be pushed back more than 50 miles from their original positions. By the time the line finally held, at the ridges around Thala and Sbiba, approximately 6,300 American soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans at first were unimpressed. The United States Army, the new arrival on the European battlefield, had just suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in its history. General Omar Bradley would later describe the opening days of that battle as the worst performance in the long history of the United States Army. And yet, fewer than 18 months later, those same American divisions would break the German army in Normandy, race across France faster than any field army in modern history, and close the jaws on the Third Reich from the west. They would do it not by copying the Germans, and not by imitating the British or the French or the Soviets. They would do it by fighting a war that looked, to every other army on the continent, strange, wasteful, sometimes reckless, and profoundly unlike anything European soldiers had seen before. This is the story of why American infantry advanced differently than European armies in World War II, and it is the story of what that difference cost and what it bought. To understand what American infantry became, you first have to understand what it was. The basic building block of the United States Army in the Second World War was the Triangular Infantry Division. Roughly 15,000 men strong, it was organized around 3 infantry regiments, each containing 3 battalions, each battalion containing 3 rifle companies, 3 into 3 into 3. The pattern repeated all the way down to the smallest tactical unit, the rifle squad of 12 men. The design was deliberate. American planners, led by the austere and demanding General Leslie McNair, wanted a division that was lean, flexible, and capable of fighting on 3 axes at once. 2 regiments would engage the enemy, while a third was held in reserve, ready to exploit a breakthrough or plug a gap. It was a structure built for maneuver, for initiative, and for the kind of fluid, fast-moving war that American planners believed the next conflict would become. The men who filled these divisions carried equipment that, in 1941 and 1942, was unique in the world. Every American rifleman was issued the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as the soldier could pull the trigger. No other major army gave its infantry a semi-automatic rifle as the standard weapon. The German Wehrmacht still relied on the bolt-action Kar-98K. The British carried the bolt-action Lee Enfield. The Soviets, the Mosin Nagant, when General George S. Patton later called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not exaggerating for effect. He meant it. American riflemen could generate substantially higher rates of aimed fire than their bolt-action counterparts, and the cumulative effect across a battlefield was decisive. Beyond the Garand, the American rifle squad carried the Browning automatic rifle, known to the troops simply as the BAR. Every squad had one, and around it the entire squad maneuvered. In 1943, American infantry also began receiving the bazooka, a shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher that gave riflemen, for the first time in history, the ability to destroy enemy tanks without specialized equipment. Add to this the M1 carbine for officers and support troops, the Thompson submachine gun, the M1919 medium machine gun, the 60mm and 81mm mortars distributed down to the company and battalion level, and the American Rifle Company was, by pound of firepower per man, the most heavily armed infantry unit in the world. Behind all of this stood something no European army possessed at that scale, an entire continent of factories. American industry in 1941 was larger than the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. By 1944, it was larger than the output of the entire rest of the world combined. The United States produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft during the war, more than 86,000 tanks, and in excess of 2 million military trucks. Every American division that landed in Europe was fully motorized, meaning every soldier, every weapon, every ration, every round of ammunition moved on wheels. No other army in the world could say that. The German Wehrmacht, for all its reputation for mechanized warfare, still relied on horses to haul the majority of its artillery and supplies. Nearly 3 million horses and mules served in the German army during the war. The British were partially motorized. The Soviets, despite receiving enormous quantities of American trucks through Lend-Lease, remained dependent on foot and animal power throughout much of the conflict. American infantry, in other words, was built to ride, it was built to shoot, and it was built to be supplied on a scale that no European planner, sitting in Berlin or London or Moscow, could quite believe was possible. The war that American infantry entered was not the war its planners had imagined. When General George C. Marshall took over as Army Chief of Staff in 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world in size, behind Portugal and just ahead of Bulgaria. It had fewer than 200,000 men under arms. Most of its equipment dated from the First World War, and it had never fought a war on the scale that was now coming. In less than 5 years, Marshall would have to build an army of more than 8 million men, train it, equip it, transport it across 2 oceans, and hurl it into combat against the most professional armies on Earth. The strategic situation he faced was unlike anything any American commander had ever confronted. Germany controlled most of continental Europe, Japan controlled most of the Western Pacific and much of China. The Soviet Union was fighting for its life on the Eastern Front. Britain was bombed, besieged, and running short of everything. American forces would have to fight in North Africa, in Italy, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in the jungles of New Guinea, on the beaches of the Central Pacific, and in the mountains of the Philippines, often simultaneously. The logistical problem alone, moving an army of this size across oceans and sustaining it at the end of supply lines thousands of miles long, had no precedent in military history. The doctrinal problem was just as severe. American officers studying the campaigns of 1939, 1940, and 1941 had watched the German army dismantle Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6 weeks, and slice deep into the Soviet Union in a summer. The term blitzkrieg entered the English language as a description of something new and terrifying, a kind of warfare where mechanized forces, close air support, and wireless communications combined to produce speed that infantry armies of the First World War could not have imagined. The question facing American planners was simple and agonizing. How do you build an army, almost from scratch, that can fight that kind of war? Their answer was not to copy the Germans. The Americans concluded, correctly, that they did not have the time, the officer corps, or the decades of cultural and professional tradition to replicate the German way of war. The Wehrmacht ran on Auftragstaktik, or mission-type orders, a command philosophy that traced its roots back to the Prussian military reforms of the early 1800s. Under Auftragstaktik, a commander was given an objective and the resources to achieve it, and was then expected to decide for himself, at the lowest possible level, how to accomplish the mission. It was flexible, it was fast, and it produced a generation of German junior officers who could make decisions under pressure with remarkable skill. But it took decades to produce those officers. The American army, growing more than 40 times over in the space of 5 years, did not have decades. Instead, American planners chose a different path. They would build an army that substituted firepower for experience, motorization for tradition, and industrial mass for tactical finesse. They would train their soldiers to a common standard, equip them on a scale no other nation could match, and rely on overwhelming material superiority to carry them through the mistakes that any new army inevitably makes. The doctrine that emerged from the War Department in 1941, codified in Field Manual 100-5, Operations, was built on a single core principle: fire and movement. Infantry would advance under the covering fire of its own automatic weapons and supporting artillery. Tanks would support infantry. Artillery would mass its fire from dispersed positions. Air power would strike ahead of the ground advance. Every arm would reinforce every other arm. It was, in the most literal sense, the doctrine of combined arms. But the golden age of the rifleman alone, the lone infantryman deciding battles with his personal weapon, was drawing to a close. The war that was coming would be decided by the things the rifleman brought with him. The radio on his back, the artillery behind him, the planes above him, the trucks and ships and factories behind all of that. And no one yet knew how well the Americans could learn to fight that kind of war. In the summer of 1942, the 1st American divisions began their long journey to the fighting fronts. For the young men in those divisions, the experience of joining the wartime army was a shock that would shape the rest of their lives. Most were draftees, plucked from farms and factories and classrooms and stores. They trained at sprawling camps in places most of them had never heard of before: Fort Benning, Fort Leonard Wood, Fort Polk, Camp Croft. They learned to march 25 miles a day with 60 pounds on their backs. They learned to strip and reassemble the M1 Garand blindfolded. They learned the hand signals for halt and advance and take cover. They learned the 3 rates of rifle fire: slow, sustained, and rapid. They learned, or tried to learn, the things that soldiers have always tried to learn: how to stay alive. Daily life in training was relentless, but, for most of them, not yet frightening. Reveille at 5:30, breakfast in the mess hall, close-order drill on the parade ground, classroom instruction on map reading and first aid and the articles of war, field problems in the afternoon, cleaning weapons in the evening, mail call, letters home written by the thousands, carefully cleared by unit censors who reviewed every line for any detail that might help an enemy. Friday night passes to the nearest town, where bars filled up with young men in uniform and the locals learned to sell a lot of beer. Sunday services in the chapel. It was, for an entire generation of American men, the most regimented period of their lives, and for many of them, it would be the last settled period before the storm. Nearly 8 million Americans went through this training pipeline during the war. Nearly 8 million men passed through the doors of induction centers, put on the olive drab uniform, and were transformed, at least on paper, into soldiers. Not all of them would see combat. Perhaps 4 million would wear the uniform of the Army Ground Forces. Perhaps 1.5 million of those would fight in the European theatre of operations. And of those, the men in the rifle companies would absorb casualty rates higher than any other branch of service. But in 1942, in 1943, none of them yet knew that. The summer days in training camps were long and hot. The weather across the American South was clear and blue, the air heavy with the smell of pine and red clay dust. Men in barracks wrote letters, played cards, argued about baseball, complained about the food. They listened to Glenn Miller on the radio. They did the things that young men have always done when they have been taken from their homes and thrown together with other young men under the pressure of something enormous that has not quite arrived yet. In the classrooms, instructors taught the doctrine that had been codified in 1941: combined arms, fire and movement, tanks and infantry and artillery and air power working in concert. No young soldier looking at those diagrams could have imagined how much blood it would cost to make real arrows move across real ground. Many of these men wrote home in the confident, cheerful tones that American soldiers have always used in letters to their mothers. The training, they said, was tough but fair. The officers were fine. The food was terrible. The equipment was the best in the world. Everything was going to be all right. The doctrine, on paper, was sound. The weapons were sound. The training was, by any historical standard, extraordinarily thorough. The army had been built. No one could have imagined, in the spring of 1943, how much that army still had to learn. Yet somewhere in the deserts of Tunisia, where green American troops were about to meet veteran German panzer divisions for the first time, something was about to go terribly wrong. The lesson began in Tunisia, in mid-February of 1943. Units of the American Second Corps, under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, held a long, thin line across central Tunisia. Fredendall, a micromanager and Anglophobe, whose reinforced command post sat some 70 miles behind the front line, had dispersed his forces in small, isolated packets across the terrain. His anti-tank guns were positioned without mutual support. His infantry was spread across 3 isolated hills around the village of Sidi Bouzid, unable to give each other fire. His armour was held too far back to intervene quickly. When the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck at dawn on February 14th, They found weak points everywhere they looked. That was only the beginning of the disaster. The chain reaction of failure that followed would sweep through the American line for more than a week. Isolated infantry on Jebel Lesouda and Jebel Ksira were cut off and overrun. American armor, committed piecemeal in two desperate counterattacks on February 15th and 16th, was ground down by superior German tanks and better-handled anti-tank guns. Communications broke down. Fredendel's headquarters, deep in its reinforced bunker far from the front, issued orders based on outdated information and sometimes contradicted orders issued an hour earlier. By the night of February 16th, the Second Corps had lost nearly 1,600 men, almost 100 tanks, and scores of vehicles and artillery pieces. The Americans abandoned Spatla and fell back toward the Grand Dorsal Mountains. On February 19th and 20th, Rommel's forces broke through at Kasserine Pass itself, and the retreat became a rout. Inside the rifle companies, the collapse was worse than the maps suggested. Soldiers who had trained for a year and a half in the United States, who had crossed the Atlantic believing they were ready, found themselves under artillery fire of an intensity and accuracy they had never experienced. German 88mm guns, firing from concealed positions, picked off American vehicles at ranges of a mile or more. German infantry, moving in small practice teams, infiltrated between American positions and rolled up their flanks. American troops who had been told that their training was the best in the world discovered, in the space of a few hours, that it had not been enough. Some units fought well, others did not. Some surrendered after brief firefights, others simply broke. Men abandoned vehicles and equipment. They walked, and then ran, to the rear. The structural problem was not that the American soldier was a coward. He was not. The problem was that the American army, as a system, was not yet ready to fight the war it had walked into. The training, however long, had not prepared men for the psychological shock of veteran German combined arms. The doctrine, however sound on paper, had not yet been internalized in the bones of junior officers and sergeants. The command structure, dominated by peacetime careerists who had risen by seniority rather than merit, was in some cases actively destructive. Within 2 weeks of the battle's end, Fredendall would be relieved. Eisenhower sent him home. The new commander of the Second Corps would be George S. Patton. The Americans had been driven back more than 50 miles. The British First Army to the north was forced to redeploy units to plug the gap. French forces scrambled to cover their exposed flanks. In London and in Washington, Allied planners watched the maps with growing alarm. There was, for a few brief days, genuine fear that the Germans might drive all the way to the Mediterranean coast and cut the Allied armies in half. And then, something happened that would define the American way of war for the rest of the conflict. The Americans brought up their artillery. The United States Army's field artillery, almost alone among the branches, had entered the war ready. Its officers, trained between the wars at Fort Sill, had developed a system of fire direction and control that was, quite simply, the best in the world. At the heart of it was a technique called time on target, or TOT, in which multiple batteries from multiple battalions could coordinate their fires so that all their shells arrived at a single target at the same moment. A German unit caught under a TOT strike experienced not a gradual escalation of fire but a sudden, overwhelming hammer blow, as if the sky itself had opened up. Combined with the Fire Direction Center, a simple but revolutionary innovation that allowed a forward observer to call in the guns of multiple battalions with a single radio call, American artillery could put more shells on a target, faster, and with more accuracy than any other artillery in the world. At Thala, at Sbiba, and in the passes leading out of Kasserine, as the German advance began to culminate, American artillery finally got its range. Battery after battery registered on the advancing German columns. Division artillery joined corps. Artillery joined anti-aircraft guns, firing in the ground role. The defenders, now a combined force of American, British, and French troops, held. Rommel's spearheads, which had torn through the American infantry with ease, now ran into walls of steel and high explosive that no amount of veteran experience could break through. German casualties mounted. Fuel and ammunition ran short at the end of long, exposed supply lines. On February 22nd, Rommel called off the offensive. Within another 2 days, the Germans were in retreat. The Americans had been humiliated, but they had also, in the last extremity, discovered the thing they were good at. They were good at mass. They were good at firepower. They were good at the technical coordination of complex combined arms operations. And they would remember. Then everything fell silent, as the dust settled over Kasserine and the Americans counted their dead. The tally came in the following week. The American Second Corps had lost approximately 6,300 men killed, wounded, or captured. 183 tanks had been destroyed. More than 100 half-tracks, 200 guns, and some 500 vehicles had been abandoned or lost. Entire companies had ceased to exist on unit rolls. It was, by any honest measure, a disaster. But the men who survived Kasserine, and the officers who had watched it happen, began immediately to change the way the American army fought. Within weeks, Patton had taken over the Second Corps and had begun the brutal work of restoring discipline, tightening command, and rebuilding confidence. Units that had broken were pulled out of line, reorganized, retrained, and sent back. Officers who had failed were relieved without ceremony. Junior commanders who had shown initiative were promoted. New doctrine pamphlets were written and distributed within days of the battle. The Army's combat manuals, already thick with the lessons of the First World War, began to fill with the hard, specific lessons of the Second. The casualties at Kasserine were a fraction of what would come. Before the war ended, more than 230,000 American soldiers would be killed in combat, and more than 500,000 would be wounded in the army alone. The European theatre would account for most of those losses. Infantry would suffer the worst of them. Rifle companies made up only a small fraction of an American division's total strength, but they absorbed the great majority of its casualties. By one of the grim measurements of the Second World War, some American rifle companies that landed in Normandy in June of 1944 had, by May of 1945, sustained casualties in excess of 100% of their original strength. In some divisions, the figure was higher still. The men standing in the line at the end were, in many cases, not the men who had stood in it at the beginning. Some of the men lost at Kasserine were veterans of the National Guard divisions that had been federalized in 1940. Others were regular army men who had served since the Depression. Others were draftees who had been civilians less than 2 years earlier. They had been farmers, clerks, students, and mechanics. They had come from Brooklyn and Birmingham, from Minneapolis and Mobile, from towns so small that the loss of a single young man changed the shape of a community. They had trained together, crossed the ocean together, landed together, and now, many of them, were dead in the Tunisian sand together. Their names would appear, in the weeks that followed, in telegrams delivered to front doors across the United States. The war had reached across the Atlantic and touched, for the first time in a serious way, the interior of American life. Why did American infantry fight differently? The question has occupied military historians for more than 80 years. The official answer, offered by the Army itself in the immediate post-war years, tended to emphasize the genius of American doctrine and the ingenuity of the American soldier. But determining the exact sources of the American way of war has proven harder than that. Documents are plentiful, but often contradictory. Veterans disagreed among themselves about what had happened and why. Foreign observers saw what they expected to see. Generals wrote memoirs in which they were always right. The truth, as always in history, lies somewhere in the uncomfortable space between the comfortable answers. 3 major explanations have emerged, each examined carefully by specialists over the decades. First, the industrial explanation. American infantry fought the way it did because American industry made it possible. This is the explanation most favored by economic historians and logisticians, and there is a great deal of truth in it. The United States produced, over the course of the war, some 47 million tons of artillery ammunition, nearly 300,000 military aircraft, and more than 2 million trucks. German artillery on the Western Front regularly suffered shortages that American gunners never experienced. At times, German batteries in Normandy were reduced to firing less than 1/10 of what the Allied guns across the line could throw at them. The American way of war, built on firepower and mobility and communications, was simply the way that made best use of what American factories could build. A German division, with its horse-drawn artillery and limited motor transport, could not have fought the American way, even if its officers had wanted to. The equipment did not exist on that scale. The fuel did not exist. The production was not there. Second, the cultural explanation. American infantry fought the way it did because American culture shaped what its soldiers would accept. The United States was, in 1941, a country with no long tradition of mass conscription, no professional officer caste in the European sense, no deeply ingrained social acceptance of military casualties as the unavoidable price of national power. American commanders, unlike their German or Soviet counterparts, were expected to win with as few losses as possible. Political leaders were intensely sensitive to casualty lists. Families expected sons to come home. The preference for overwhelming firepower, for artillery preparations of unprecedented scale, for air support on targets that smaller armies might have tackled with infantry alone, reflected a cultural reality. American officers were not willing, and American society was not willing, to spend soldiers the way Soviet or even German commanders spent them. Fire before bayonets, shells before men. It was, at bottom, a democratic army fighting in a democratic way. Third, the institutional explanation. American infantry fought the way it did because the army, as an institution, made specific and sometimes controversial choices. This is the explanation most favored by modern military historians, and it is the most uncomfortable. The army, under Marshall and McNair, made a series of deliberate decisions that shaped the American way of war for good and for ill. They chose to build a smaller number of divisions, approximately 90 in total, rather than the 200 or more that earlier planners, including McNair himself, had once estimated the war would require. They chose to maintain those divisions in the line for long continuous periods, rather than rotate them out for rest. They chose an individual replacement system, in which casualties were replaced by individual soldiers shipped forward from training depots, rather than the unit replacement system used by the Germans and British. Each of these choices had consequences. Each of them shaped what happened to American infantry in Europe, and each of them is still debated, passionately, by historians today. Whether one believes that the American way of war was primarily the product of industry, or culture, or institutions, one thing is certain. Human nature being what it is, and history being what it is, none of these explanations can be completely separated from the others. American infantry fought the way it did because it was American, in all the complicated senses of that word. The issue of doctrinal difference was not new to the armies of the 20th century. History had witnessed repeatedly the challenge of armies adapting to new forms of war, each time producing a distinct national answer. In the First World War, the German army of 1918 had developed the Stoßtrupp, or storm troop, tactics that allowed small, heavily armed infantry teams to infiltrate enemy positions, bypass strong points, and penetrate deep into the rear. The Stoßtrupp approach was born of necessity, from a nation running short of manpower and looking for ways to break the stalemate of the trenches. It emphasized speed, initiative, and the delegation of command down to the lowest possible level. 2 decades later, in the late 1930s, the German army built on this heritage to produce the doctrine that the Western press called blitzkrieg. But the core of it was the same: small units, junior leaders empowered to act, infiltration, bypass, exploitation. The British Army of the Second World War drew on a different tradition. Shaped by the staggering losses of the Somme and Passchendaele in the First World War, the British High Command developed a doctrine that emphasized what General Bernard Montgomery would later call the colossal crack. Massive, meticulously planned set-piece battles in which artillery preparation, air support, and infantry advance were coordinated down to the minute. The British would prepare a battlefield for days, sometimes weeks, before the assault began. When the attack came, it came behind a rolling barrage of a scale that had not been seen since 1917. The British approach was slow, deliberate, and above all cautious. It reflected a nation that had bled its generation white in the First World War and was determined not to do so again. The Soviet army fought a third way. The doctrine had been developed in the 1920s and 1930s by a generation of theorists, including Tukhachevsky, Triandafilov, and Svechin, and was called Deep Battle or Glubokaya Operacja. It had been nearly lost during Stalin's purges of the late 1930s, when most of its authors were executed or imprisoned. It was rediscovered and rebuilt, at terrible cost, during the catastrophic fighting of 1941 and 1942, and employed with devastating effect from 1943 onward. It was, in its way, the most ambitious doctrine of the war. Massive concentrations of force at carefully chosen breakthrough points. Mechanized and tank armies held in reserve to exploit the breakthrough to depths of hundreds of miles. Operational art at a scale and audacity that the Western Allies rarely matched. But deep battle was executed at a price no democracy could have paid. Soviet military casualties during the war are still debated by historians, but the total number of military dead certainly exceeded 8 million, and by some estimates, approached or exceeded 11 million. The Red Army fought the way it fought because Stalin could demand what he demanded. Against these three traditions, the American way stood out. It was not as tactically agile as the German. It was not as methodically cautious as the British. It was not as operationally ambitious or as tolerant of losses as the Soviet. It was, instead, a doctrine of overwhelming material, combined arms, and constant pressure. It would advance every day, along every axis, never allowing the enemy to catch his breath, never engaging in the single decisive battle, always relying on the fact that there would be more men, more shells, more tanks, more planes, more trucks, and more food tomorrow than there had been today. The American army fought a war of attrition with its own industrial base on one side and the enemy on the other. And it won. But this way of war had its specific vulnerabilities. American units could be slow to react to sudden changes. Junior officers, trained to follow doctrine, sometimes lacked the initiative of their German counterparts. The individual replacement system, which kept divisions in the line for months on end, ground down the infantry in ways that the institution was slow to recognize. Above all, the American military culture of the 1940s tended to prioritize firepower over finesse, mass over maneuver. Sometimes this cost more lives than it saved. Sometimes it saved many more than it cost. The truth depended, as it always depends in war, on the specific circumstances of a specific day. News of the first American victories in late 1943 and 1944 reached the home front in waves. The victory in Tunisia in May of 1943. The landings in Sicily in July. The slow, grinding campaign up the Italian peninsula. The landings in Normandy in June of 1944. The breakout at Saint-Lô in July. The race across France in August. Each victory was celebrated in American newspapers, on American radio programs, in American newsreels. The confidence that had been shaken at Kasserine was restored and then redoubled. By the fall of 1944, it seemed to many Americans that the war in Europe was all but won. And yet, inside the divisions doing the fighting, the mood was darker than the headlines suggested. Materially, the American effort was enormous and sustained. Divisions in the European theatre received, on average, many thousands of replacements during the course of the campaign, in some cases turning over their rifle companies 2 or 3 times over. The replacement system, which sent individual soldiers from training depots to replace individual casualties in existing units, kept divisions on the line, but produced a specific and terrible form of psychological damage. Replacements arrived alone. They did not know the men they were joining. The men they were joining did not know them, and, fearing what was coming, often did not want to know them. The casualty rates among new replacements in their first days on the line were extraordinarily high. Men who survived their first week had a much better chance of surviving the next. But many did not survive their first week. They died, often, with no one in their unit knowing their names. The material scale of the war obscured, for a long time, the human scale of what was happening inside the rifle company. A division that remained on the rolls with the same numerical designation from Normandy to the Rhine was, in terms of actual human beings, 3 or 4 different divisions by the end. The men who landed on Omaha Beach in June were, by and large, dead or wounded, or rotated out by November. The men who crossed the Rhine in March of 1945 were, in many cases, men who had been civilians in October. Unlike those who fell at Kasserine, who at least had fallen together among comrades they knew, many of the replacements who died in the Hürtgen Forest or the Ardennes or the Rhineland died as strangers to the units they were notionally part of. It was a tragedy within the larger tragedy of the war. Families received the telegrams that American families had come to dread. Mothers and fathers learned that their sons had died in places whose names they had never heard. Wives became widows, young widows, many of them with children. There was glory attached to some of these deaths, the glory of victories like Saint-Lô and Aachen and Bastogne. But there was also a quieter grief at the scale of it, the grief of men who had died anonymously in a system that had treated them, with the best of intentions, as interchangeable parts in a vast machine. The army instituted changes as the war went on. The replacement system was adjusted. Units were rotated for rest when circumstances permitted. Efforts were made to integrate replacements more humanely into their new units. But these improvements came slowly, and they came too late for many of the young men who had been fed into the line during the brutal autumn and winter of 1944 and 1945. The system continued because it worked, on its own terms. It kept the divisions in the line. It kept the pressure on the enemy. It won the war. But the cost, measured in individual lives and individual families and individual small American towns, was something that the country would be counting for decades. After the war ended in 1945, the American way of war did not disappear. It evolved. It spread. It became, for better or worse, the intellectual property of the United States Army for the rest of the 20th century. The divisions that had fought in Europe were, for the most part, demobilized. Millions of men returned to civilian life under the provisions of the GI Bill. They went back to school, bought houses, raised families, and built the America of the post-war decades. The army shrank rapidly, from more than 8 million men at its peak to less than 600,000 within a few years. But the doctrine remained, codified in training manuals and taught at the Army's schools at Fort Leavenworth and Fort Benning and Fort Sill. When the Korean War began in 1950, the American army that went to Korea was smaller, leaner, and in many ways less prepared than the army of 1945 had been. But it fought with the same basic doctrine: firepower, mobility, combined arms, artillery on call, close air support, logistics on a scale the North Koreans and later the Chinese could not match. The American way of war, tested in Europe, was tested again on the Korean peninsula. It survived. The lessons of the Second World War shaped American military thinking throughout the Cold War. The doctrine of air-land battle, developed in the 1970s and 80s to confront the massed armored forces of the Warsaw Pact, was, in its essential logic, a direct descendant of the combined arms doctrine of 1944. The emphasis on deep attack, on combined arms coordination, on the integration of air power and ground power, traced its lineage back to Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group and George Patton's 3rd Army. Every American officer who studied at the Command and General Staff College learned, whether he knew it or not, the lessons that had been paid for in blood in France and Belgium and Germany. It was decided, by and large, that the American way of war would remain the American way of war. Some elements were modernized. The individual replacement system was eventually reformed in favor of unit rotation. The rifle squad was reorganized multiple times. New weapons replaced old ones. But the underlying philosophy, firepower over maneuver, mass over finesse, the coordination of every arm with every other arm, the absolute priority given to keeping American casualties as low as possible, remained. It remains to this day, more than 80 years after the fighting ended, recognizable in the doctrine of the United States Army. The wrecks of the war, the burned tanks and crashed aircraft and abandoned equipment, have mostly been cleared away. But some of them still lie where they fell, at the bottom of the English Channel, in the forests of the Ardennes, in the fields of Normandy. They are protected in many cases as war graves. Disturbing them by the laws of the countries where they rest is forbidden, out of respect for the men who still lie entombed within them. At sites across Europe and across the United States, the memory of American infantry in the Second World War is preserved in concrete form. The American Battle Monuments Commission, established by Congress in 1923, maintains 14 permanent American World War II military cemeteries overseas, most of them in Europe, where more than 92,000 American war dead are buried. The largest and most famous is the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleyville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, where more than 9,300 American soldiers lie in rows beneath white marble crosses and stars of David. Other cemeteries in Belgium, Luxembourg, France, England, the Netherlands, Italy, Tunisia, and the Philippines hold the remains of men who fell from North Africa to Germany to the islands of the Pacific, Each one is maintained in perpetuity. Each one is visited, every year, by family members and descendants who come to stand at the graves of men they never met. In the United States, the National World War II Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, dedicated in 2004, commemorates the 16 million Americans who served. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, founded by historian Stephen Ambrose and others, tells the story of the American war effort in detail, with particular emphasis on the experience of the ordinary soldier. Regimental museums, division museums, and state memorials across the country preserve the records and the artifacts of specific units, specific campaigns, and specific men. Each year, on the 6th of June, the anniversary of the Normandy landings, survivors and descendants gather at Omaha Beach and at the cemetery above it. They lay flowers. They offer prayers. They read the names of men who never came home. For many years, the ceremonies were led by the veterans themselves, men in their 60s and 70s and 80s who had, as young soldiers, stormed those beaches and crossed those hedgerows and fought those battles. Their numbers decreased with each passing year as they grew old and passed away. By 2025, fewer than 50,000 veterans of the Second World War were still alive in the United States, and that number was falling by more than 100 every day. Soon, there will be none. But the memory of what they did, and the way they did it, is preserved by younger generations who feel a duty to remember. The American infantry of the Second World War did not fight the most skillful war on the European continent. That honor, if it can be called an honor, probably belongs to the veteran divisions of the Wehrmacht. The Americans did not fight the most methodical war. That was the British. They did not fight the most operationally ambitious war, or the most tolerant of losses. That was the Soviet. They fought, instead, a war that reflected the country they came from, a war of abundance, a war of mass production, a war of firepower and mobility and relentless, grinding pressure. A war that could only have been fought by a democracy with the largest industrial base in human history behind it. The men who fought that war were, for the most part, not professional soldiers. They were citizens. They were fathers and sons and brothers and husbands. They had come from every state and every background and every walk of American life. They were farmers from Kansas and steel workers from Pittsburgh, and college students from Boston, and Mexican-American kids from San Antonio, and African-American soldiers from segregated units in the Jim Crow South who fought with a courage that their country, at the time, refused to fully recognize. They were given a task that no previous generation of Americans had ever been asked to perform, and they performed it. The way they performed it was, and still is, worth studying. The American way of war in 1941 through 1945 was not inevitable. It was a choice, made by a small number of senior officers in the years before the war, and refined by a much larger number of junior officers and sergeants during it. It was shaped by American industry, by American culture, by American politics, and by the specific personalities of the men who ran the army in that specific moment of history. It had strengths that no other army possessed. It had weaknesses that no other army had to accept. It was distinctively, recognizably, American. The story of American infantry in the Second World War is not only a story of victory, it is a story of learning. It is a story of a country that, in 1943, could be humiliated in the Tunisian desert, and, in 1945, could stand astride the Rhine as the dominant land army in the Western world. It is a story of the specific price that was paid for that transformation. More than 200,000 American soldiers dead in combat. More than 500,000 wounded. Families changed forever in towns whose names would never appear in the history books. An entire generation of young American men who went to Europe to fight a war they had not chosen, and who came home, many of them, to a country that would spend the rest of the century remembering what they had done. Today, as the last survivors of that generation grow old and pass into memory, the task of understanding this story belongs to those who come after. Museums, memorials, archives, books, and the quieter remembrance that happens at kitchen tables when grandchildren ask grandfathers about the war. All of these preserve what can be preserved. The American way of war that emerged from the Second World War shaped the country and the world for the rest of the 20th century. It deserves to be studied, not to be glorified, but to be understood. To understand why American infantry advanced differently than European armies, is to understand something important about America itself. In that moment when it first took its place as the dominant military power on Earth, and about the ordinary men, millions of them, who carried the weight of that moment on their own backs, one step at a time, across a continent that had already been torn apart by war. They deserve to be remembered, not as statues but as men. The way they fought, and the way they died, was distinctively American. And the country that sent them is still, in many ways, the country they made.